When Europeans first arrived on the shores of the Americas in the late 15th century, they carried with them not only ambitions of wealth and exploration but also a worldview that regarded indigenous peoples as inferior. Native Americans had lived on the land for thousands of years with highly organized societies, spiritual traditions, and sustainable ways of life. But for Europeans, the vast continent appeared as empty land waiting to be claimed, a perception that would fuel centuries of displacement and extermination. The early contacts often began with trade and curiosity, yet misunderstandings and competition soon escalated into conflict. One of the greatest tragedies that shaped the fate of Native Americans was the introduction of diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native populations had no immunity, and entire villages were wiped out within decades. This demographic collapse weakened their ability to resist European encroachment, leaving them vulnerable to conquest. While disease was not deliberately spread in every case, there are historical accounts of instances where settlers and soldiers weaponized it, such as distributing smallpox-infected blankets. This biological catastrophe reduced the Native American population by millions and created the conditions for systematic dispossession. Beyond disease, the ideology of European colonists played a central role in the genocide. The doctrine of discovery, backed by the Catholic Church, declared that lands not inhabited by Christians could be claimed by Christian rulers. This doctrine stripped Native Americans of legal and spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of colonizers. As settlers expanded, they justified their violence with religious zeal, claiming they were carrying out a divine mission to civilize or convert so-called savages. This mix of faith, greed, and racism laid the foundation for centuries of warfare and oppression. Colonists competed with native tribes over resources such as fertile land, hunting grounds, and waterways. As European settlements grew, indigenous peoples were increasingly pushed off their ancestral territories. Each generation of colonists saw expansion as a natural right, often disregarding treaties they signed with native tribes. These broken promises, coupled with massacres of villages and forced relocations, gradually eroded native sovereignty. The genocide was not a single event but a prolonged process, rooted in both deliberate violence and systemic dispossession. Part 2. The 18th and 19th centuries marked a turning point where U.S. government policies openly embraced removal and extermination. Leaders of the new American Republic saw native peoples as obstacles to progress and national growth. The expansionist mindset, later called manifest destiny, declared that it was the destiny of the United States to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This belief turned indigenous lands into targets for settlers, farmers, and industries seeking. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the fate of Native Americans was increasingly sealed by deliberate policies of the United States government and by the relentless expansion of settlers across the continent. What began in the earlier colonial era as sporadic conflicts and waves of disease turned into a structured and systematic effort to remove, contain, or destroy indigenous peoples. By this time, the young American Republic had begun to think of itself as a nation destined to rule the entire continent. This belief, later described by the term manifest destiny, justified expansion from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To the political leaders, settlers, and businessmen of the time, Native Americans stood as obstacles to progress, to agriculture, to mining, to railroads, and to the building of towns and cities. What followed was a century in which the dispossession of native peoples became both a national policy and a cultural mindset, leading to widespread death, displacement, and cultural destruction. The early decades of the United States were marked by a mixture of negotiation, treaties, and violence. Tribes were often forced into signing treaties that they did not fully understand, treaties written in English legal terms that ignored indigenous traditions of land stewardship. These agreements promised peace and protection but usually resulted in the loss of millions of acres of native land. When native leaders resisted, military force was deployed to crush them. The government justified its actions by portraying indigenous peoples as hostile savages, ignoring the fact that it was settlers and soldiers who had encroached on their territories. In many cases, tribes were offered food, goods, or money in exchange for land, but the agreements were rarely honored in the long run. Even when treaties were signed with the highest promises, they were violated as soon as settlers or politicians desired new lands. By the early 19th century, pressure for removal had reached new heights. Cotton farming had exploded in the American South, creating a hunger for land that stretched into territories long inhabited by native nations such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These groups, sometimes called the Five Civilized Tribes because they had adopted certain aspects of European-style governance, still faced growing hostility. Their lands were fertile, strategically valuable, and coveted by settlers. Andrew Jackson, a military general celebrated for his victories over native groups, rose to the presidency in 1828 and immediately set removal as a priority. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the forced relocation of native peoples living east of the Mississippi River to lands further west. This policy led directly to the infamous Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee, along with members of other southeastern tribes, were rounded up and forced to march hundreds of miles to designated Indian. By the end of the 19th century, the genocide of Native Americans had shifted from outright warfare to policies designed to erase cultures and identities. The United States had already subdued most tribes militarily, confining them to reservations and breaking their ability to resist through armed struggle. What followed was a different kind of destruction, cultural genocide carried out through forced assimilation. Native children were removed from their families and placed in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their religions, or honor their traditions. Teachers and administrators pushed the belief that indigenous culture was backward and uncivilized. The schools operated under the notorious motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," which reflected the broader national goal of transforming native peoples into something resembling Euro-American citizens, even if it meant erasing everything that made them distinct. Generations of children endured physical punishment, emotional trauma, and abuse, growing up disconnected from their heritage and families. This loss of language and tradition weakened cultural transmission, creating long-term scars that continue to affect native communities. At the same time, reservation life was engineered to weaken native societies further. Families were forced onto smaller and less fertile plots of land, often far from their ancestral homelands where their ways of life had developed for centuries. Hunting grounds, sacred spaces, and rivers central to spiritual practices were taken away, leaving tribes unable to sustain themselves in traditional ways. Poverty, disease, and hunger became common realities. The government introduced the allotment system through the Dawes Act of 1887, which divided communal lands into individual family plots. This policy clashed with indigenous traditions of collective ownership and created opportunities for white settlers to seize surplus lands left over after allotment. Instead of empowering native families, the act fragmented tribal unity, sold off millions of acres to outsiders, and deepened economic dependency. The justifications behind these policies were rooted in racism and greed. Native Americans were consistently portrayed as inferior, childlike, or incapable of managing their own affairs. By stripping them of autonomy and treating them as wards of the state, the government rationalized further control over their lives. At the same time, settlers, companies, and industries saw native lands as resources to be exploited, whether for agriculture, mining, oil, or railroad construction. Every major expansion project of the United States came at the expense of native peoples, whose rights were disregarded whenever they clashed with economic ambition. What made this genocide unique was its combination of physical and cultural destruction. Earlier centuries brought waves of disease, war, and massacres, but the later policies sought to